The police never treated me like a suspect, but they kept asking me the same question every time I came in for another interview. They wanted to know why I was the last person who admitted to speaking with a young woman who had disappeared without leaving behind a single piece of evidence. At first, I thought it was just another routine investigation, but I eventually realized they weren't trying to prove I had done something to her. They were trying to understand why I remembered someone who, according to every record they had, hadn't been seen alive for more than 6 months. My name is Daniel, and until last year, I had been driving the final Route 18 bus every Friday night for almost 12 years. After spending that long on exactly the same route, you begin to notice the smallest changes. You remember which passengers always sit near the windows, which ones fall asleep before the second stop, and which houses still have lights on after midnight. The city changes completely once most people have gone home, and the silence becomes so familiar that even something as small as an unexpected cough or a pair of footsteps can catch your attention. That was probably why I noticed her the very first time she stepped onto my bus. She boarded at Ashbridge Station just after midnight wearing a dark coat and carrying a small black backpack that looked almost empty. She wasn't dressed strangely, she didn't seem frightened, and there was nothing about her appearance that would have made anyone else remember her. The only unusual thing was that she always walked to the very last seat without looking at anyone, rested the backpack beside her feet, and spent the entire journey staring out of the rear window, as though she was waiting to see something following us. At first, I assumed she was simply exhausted after work, because plenty of people used the late-night buses after finishing long shifts. But after several weeks, I realized she followed exactly the same routine every Friday. She boarded at the same stop, chose the same seat, and pressed the stop button only once, just before we reached Briar Lane. Most people wouldn't know where Briar Lane is because there isn't much there anymore. Years ago, there had been a small industrial estate with a warehouse, a repair garage, and a storage yard, but almost everything had been abandoned after a fire forced several businesses to close. By the time I started driving that route, the area consisted of nothing more than a cracked road, overgrown fencing, and an empty warehouse that looked as though it had been forgotten by everyone except the weather. The first few times she got off there, I assumed she lived nearby and simply walked a little farther than most people. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and one Friday I smiled at her through the mirror as the bus slowed to a stop before asking whether she was sure this was where she wanted to get off because there wasn't much around except the old warehouse. She looked at me for the first time since she had started riding my bus and smiled politely before saying, "Someone is always waiting for me." There was nothing unusual about the way she said it. She sounded calm, almost comforting, as though she was reassuring me rather than answering a question. She stepped onto the pavement, disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlight, and within a few seconds I couldn't see her anymore. For the next 2 months, nothing changed. Every Friday, she appeared at exactly the same time, sat in exactly the same place, and disappeared down the same deserted road without ever looking back. I even found myself checking the mirror whenever we reached Ashbridge Station because, if she wasn't already waiting there, I felt as though something about the night was different. Then one Friday, everything changed. Heavy rain had been falling for hours, and by the time my shift reached its final route, the streets were almost empty. Water streamed across the windscreen faster than the wipers could clear it, while the headlights reflected off the wet road so brightly that everything outside looked slightly blurred. Every passenger who boarded the bus that night came inside dripping wet, shaking umbrellas or brushing rainwater from their coats. But when she stepped through the doors, I immediately noticed that her hair and clothes were completely dry. It didn't make any sense because she hadn't been standing beneath the station shelter when I arrived. I had seen her walking toward the bus through the rain, yet not a single drop of water appeared to be on her coat. I considered asking whether she had come by car or been dropped off nearby, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the strange feeling that asking questions about her would somehow be crossing a line that neither of us had acknowledged until that moment. When we finally reached Briar Lane, I pulled the bus over as usual and opened the doors before glancing into the mirror to let her know we had arrived. Instead of standing up immediately, she remained seated for several seconds while looking directly at me through the reflection. Then she smiled again and said quietly, "Whatever happens tonight, don't open these doors a second time." At first I thought she was joking, but there wasn't the slightest hint of humor on her face. She picked up her backpack, stepped off the bus, and disappeared into the darkness once again. About 20 seconds later, just as I was preparing to pull away, I heard 3 gentle knocks against the side of the bus. They weren't loud enough to sound desperate, and they certainly weren't the kind of pounding someone would make if they had missed their ride. Instead, they sounded slow and deliberate, as though whoever made them wanted me to know they were standing only a few feet away. I checked both mirrors immediately. The pavement was empty. The road behind me was empty. Even the rain seemed quieter than it had been a few moments earlier. I told myself it was probably a loose branch or debris blowing across the road, put the bus into gear, and drove away. The following morning, detectives were waiting for me at the depot. They didn't waste any time with small talk. One of them placed a photograph on the table and asked whether I recognized the woman. I answered almost immediately because I had seen her less than 12 hours earlier, but the expression on their faces changed the moment I said that. One detective leaned back in his chair while the other quietly explained that the woman in the photograph, whose name was Emily Carter, had disappeared 6 months earlier after finishing work at a nearby hospital. According to every witness statement they had collected, she had boarded a late-night bus and was never seen again. I laughed because I genuinely believed they had mixed up the dates, but then they showed me the missing person report, CCTV stills from the station, and the timeline of the investigation. Everything matched except one detail. The CCTV from Ashbridge Station clearly showed Emily walking toward my bus, but when they reviewed the footage from the camera inside the vehicle, the seat where I remembered her sitting was completely empty. At first I thought they had loaded the wrong recording, but they played it again from another angle. Every passenger who had boarded that night was visible. A young couple sat near the middle, an elderly man got off 3 stops later, and a university student slept with headphones on until the end of the route. The only person missing was Emily. According to the recording, nobody had ever walked to the back of the bus. The police questioned every passenger they could identify from the footage. None of them remembered seeing a young woman sitting at the back, and several of them insisted they had looked toward the rear of the bus during the journey because it was unusually empty that night. I couldn't explain it. I knew exactly what I had seen because I had spoken to her almost every Friday for months. For weeks, the investigation went nowhere. Detectives searched the abandoned warehouse beside Briar Lane, scanned the surrounding woodland with dogs, drained a nearby canal, and even interviewed former employees who had worked there years earlier, but every search ended the same way. There were no footprints, no fingerprints, no blood, and no sign that anyone had entered the building in years. Just when everyone seemed ready to give up, one of the forensic officers noticed something unusual inside the warehouse. A section of the concrete floor sounded hollow, and after several hours of carefully breaking it open, they uncovered a narrow staircase leading underground. The room beneath was far larger than anyone expected. It contained rows of old wooden chairs facing a single reinforced window that looked directly toward the bus stop outside. There was no electricity, no furniture, and no personal belongings, but the dust on the floor told a different story. Someone had been cleaning the room regularly because there were no cobwebs anywhere, and the chairs were arranged with perfect precision as though people had only recently stood up and walked away. The strangest discovery wasn't inside the room itself. It was the collection of photographs stacked neatly inside a waterproof storage box beneath one of the chairs. Every photograph showed my bus. Some had been taken during daylight years before I ever drove that route, while others had clearly been taken only weeks earlier. The angle never changed. Every picture had been captured through the same underground window, and every single one showed passengers getting on or off the bus. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. In dozens of those photographs, I could see myself sitting behind the steering wheel. In every single one, someone had circled one particular passenger with a red pen. The faces were different each time. The dates stretched back almost 15 years. Every person whose face had been circled was later confirmed by police records to have disappeared within 48 hours. That was the moment the investigation stopped being treated as a missing persons case and became something much larger. The detectives believed they were looking at someone who had been studying victims for years, choosing people who traveled alone, learning their routines, and waiting until they became predictable enough to vanish without attracting immediate attention. Whoever had done it understood police investigations remarkably well because they never left physical evidence, never contacted families, and never demanded money. They simply erased people from ordinary life. Months passed without another lead, and eventually I resigned from the bus company because I couldn't force myself to drive that route anymore. Every time I closed the doors, I found myself checking the mirrors over and over again, convinced someone would be standing behind the bus where nobody should have been. I tried to move on with my life, but about 6 months later my phone rang just after midnight. The number was hidden, and when I answered I heard nothing except slow breathing for several seconds before a calm voice finally spoke. "You've been asking the wrong question." The voice belonged to a man who sounded neither young nor old. He spoke politely, without raising his voice or rushing a single word. He continued, "You've been wondering where they went. You should have been asking why they all chose your bus." Before I could respond, the line disconnected. The police traced the call, but found nothing useful. Whoever had contacted me knew exactly how to avoid leaving a digital trail. A week later, another envelope appeared in my letterbox without a stamp or return address. Inside was a photograph of me sitting in the driver's seat on my very first shift 12 years earlier. I had never seen that photograph before. Someone had written a single sentence across the back in careful handwriting. "You noticed the passengers. You never noticed who was counting them." The detectives immediately checked every CCTV camera at the depot from my first week of work, hoping they might identify whoever had taken the photograph. They found him. For less than 2 seconds, one camera captured a man standing across the road watching buses leave the depot. He wasn't hiding his face or trying to avoid being seen. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets before calmly walking away. When investigators enlarged the image, they realized he was wearing the same dark coat visible in security footage taken outside the warehouse nearly 10 years later. He hadn't aged. The case remains open today. Sometimes people ask why I refuse to use buses anymore, and I usually tell them I'd simply rather drive myself. The truth is much harder to explain. A few nights ago, I was sitting in my car outside a supermarket when a city bus stopped at the traffic lights beside me. I glanced through the windows without thinking, and right at the back, sitting alone beside the rear window, was Emily. She looked exactly the same as she had the night she disappeared. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply looked past me toward the pavement on the opposite side of the road, where a man in a dark coat was quietly counting the passengers as they stepped off the bus. After that night, I handed every photograph, every letter, and every piece of evidence I had to the police before moving to another city and changing jobs. The detectives admitted they believed someone had been targeting people along that route for years, but without a suspect or forensic evidence. The investigation eventually slowed down until it became another unsolved case sitting in a filing cabinet. I still think about Emily every time I pass a bus stop late at night, because I know she was a real person with a family who never got answers. Every few months I search the news to see whether they've finally arrested someone, but nothing ever appears. Maybe they never will. If there's one thing I learned from everything that happened, it's that dangerous people don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they're patient enough to spend months watching ordinary routines until nobody notices they're being watched at all. That's what frightens me most, because there wasn't anything unusual about that bus route until people started disappearing, and by then it was already too late. Some cases don't become famous. They simply stop making the news, while the families keep waiting for someone who never comes home.